So in modern Africa, we have a situation that overall is kind of set up in a way in which the lack of these European powers, the removal of these European powers through these independence movements, is going to leave a continent that's predominantly poor and struggling. So if we look at this slide here on contemporary Africa, we get kind of an idea of some of the major issues that Africans face today. First one is a system called non-alignment. This is primarily during the Cold War, and what this system does is it really kind of sets up a sort of a system of independence based upon neutrality. Non-alignment is about not getting involved in this Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans throughout much of the 20th century, not taking sides, benefiting from both, um, which allows Africans to have, it's probably a good step forward for them because they are able to benefit. But the reality of the situation is many of them cannot control themselves, cannot provide for themselves, and so many of these African colonies are going to be heavily reliant on their former colonial powers. So the former French colonies are going to really rely on France for economic support. The former British colonies will really rely on the British for economic support, and goods and resources. And so it's you have these almost like welfare state countries that really need help and assistance from people on a constant basis. We addressed tribalism versus nationalism a little bit earlier, but we'll talk about it a little bit more here. But it really comes down to this whole idea that boundaries of African nations and colonies were not set based upon tribal practices or tribal boundaries. So you end up with conflicting tribes in modern nation states who maybe historically have been enemies or did not get along. And so what this is going to do is it's going to set up a system where you're going to have a lot of civil wars. You're going to have people who are going to fight against each other, and there are going to be some major problems as a result. You also have single party rule. What we mean by that is you have one political party in many of these countries, and so you don't have any kind of secondary thoughts or ways of doing things. And in many cases, this leads to military rule as well. And so throughout the 1970s and 80s, we have this huge rise of military dictators throughout Africa, people like a man by the name of Idi Amin, who is going to gain control through control of the military. You're going to have a lot of coups or coup d'états. A coup d'état is a forcible military takeover when the military kind of comes in and takes total control. And then oftentimes these military generals are going to establish themselves or place themselves in positions of political power. The result is going to be in Africa today that struggles with a lot of international debt. They rely on a lot of international aid for their food, for their services. They're constantly facing drought and famine conditions. They're facing medical and healthcare situations, including things like Ebola, the AIDS crisis, where they're heavily reliant on foreigners. And so the entire continent, for the most part, I mean, there are some areas that are doing well economically, like South Africa and Egypt. But a lot of other areas are really struggling and, for the most part, are dependent on international aid for their survival. So we're going to talk a little bit about genocide because we do have some genocidal situations in Africa. So genocide specifically is a systematic extermination of a group of people on the basis of their ethnicity, which is going to come in key here, religion, or other defining characteristics. Obviously the most obvious example would be the Holocaust in Africa, in Germany during World War II, and the identified populations being the Jews, the Roma, people who were handicapped, homosexuals, a lot of different groups that are going to be identified here. In Africa, it's really going to come down primarily to ethnic groups, that tribalism versus nationalism that we talked about a minute ago. The main area where we have a really clear example is going to be in a country called Rwanda. Rwanda's in East Central Africa, and it's a very densely populated group here, and it's an area that was colonized by the Belgians. We also have two different tribal groups here, the Hutu and the Tutsi, who were kind of forced together by these colonial boundaries. Basic idea here is we have the Hutus and the Tutsis who fight against each other prior to colonization. When the Belgians take control, what they're able to do is they're able to really kind of put an end to the struggles between the Hutus and the Tutsis. But the Tutsis, who are the minority group, really helped the Belgians in their establishment of, and the Germans of their establishment of a colony. And so they're collaborators essentially to the Hutus. What the Hutus see are these Tutsi Black Africans who are assisting the Germans and the Belgians in maintaining power. So when independence takes place in 1962, you have this downgrading of the economy, this struggle on the part of the Rwandans that's going to eventually lead to this distrust and a civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis. In April of 1994, we have an uprising of the Hutus for a number of reasons, based upon this whole idea of distrust of the Tutsis. And over a 100-day period, estimates of 800,000 to 1 million Tutsis are exterminated, killed by Hutus, oftentimes, neighbors fighting over one another, people being dragged into the street, many of them killed, not in a form of like mass graves or anything or mass extermination, but literally being macheted to death by people that they may have known and worked with right up until that time period. Eventually, this situation in Rwanda is going to come to an end, but it's really not because of any outside help. Eventually, this is going to come to an end as the situation kind of narrows down. The Americans took a lot of heat during this time period because we were essentially on the outskirts of Rwanda watching this happen and didn't intervene. The Belgians tried to help out a little bit. The United Nations sent in limited number of troops, but there really was a resistance on the part of a lot of Western nations to try to get involved in this situation because they didn't want to put their own troops at risk. And we had a situation in Somalia. You may have seen or heard of the movie Black Hawk Down, which had led to the deaths of several American soldiers. That was a really bad situation. And so because of some of these other things that had happened right before this situation, a lot of countries did not want to get involved. Today, Rwanda has recovered. They set up some truth commissions where a lot of the people who participated in this genocide came forward, told their stories, and were forgiven. And so, I don't think there's ever like a forgive and forget, but there is this sense in Rwanda that you can move on and you can move forward. The economy in Africa today, as we said before, is really about reliance on outside populations and outside countries for assistance. They do have a lot of natural resources, so they have a lot to work with, but a lot of these are owned and run by European nations and American companies. So you don't have a lot of that money going to the Africans themselves. These are just some of the historical themes that we see within Africa over a period of time. You can take a look at these, but essentially it sets up a pattern of nativistic diversity where you have people kind of living on their own. Eventually in Africa, we have the slave trade that's going to take place. That leads to European imperialism. Following these imperialistic ways in World War II, we have an ongoing independence movement, but then ongoing dependence upon these foreign countries for assistance right up until today. And then the other major thing we talked about was apartheid in South Africa, this form of segregation that's formalized and eventually comes to an end with the release of Nelson Mandela.